those opening statements, which seem to be kind of forever ago now, because we were trying to be flexible with the World Vegan Lunch programme. We were mixing social movement theory, animal rights case study, with a bit of philosophy and a couple of workshops and everything. So this is essentially, I think we've got about maybe 4 social theory bits left. The only problem is I'm not quite sure if we're going to get to it, because we're going to start off with the remainder of the case study, because that's, in a sense, kind of more interesting, and potentially we're more involved in the actual animal advocacy movement at one level or another. Yay! Hey! We're waiting for you.
Hey. Hey Frank. How's it going?
Hey Frank.
Frank, Irina, this here is Roger.
Hi guys.
You're the only people that Rod's not said, "Oh my God," to when they walk through the door.
OMG. Cake. Rachel, you know that?
Do you want to do tea now, I mean, or should we just get on, or what do you want to do?
I think we should get on.
Get on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we're going to start then with the second part of the case study. The opening bit is already on YouTube. It's called the opening statement on the animal advocacy movement as a case study, and also the opening statement on social movements as well. So they're both on YouTube. We're hoping to put this one on as well, so the two things will be a kind of companion piece to each other. We're going to start off with something that we all recognise, which is kind of perceptions of movements, and particularly perceptions of the animal movement. And we've already talked about how sociologically we can kind of zoom in and move out from the micro to the macro and then back to the micro again in terms of analysis. When you take a micro view of any movement, if you're an outsider, it's very difficult to kind of see any differences, you know. So people might say, well, what's the difference between a FAR and the ISPCA, or, you know, isn't Greenpeace part of it, and, you know, is Sea Shepherd part of it, and anything else? It could be quite difficult to kind of know the difference, the nuances of the group, especially in philosophical terms. And the difference between organisations are not overtly obvious either, which is why you'll probably see on Facebook people be liking groups which, in a sense, are kind of, you know, opposed to each other, or you know, don't kind of really kind of marry very well philosophically. So social movement activists in general will often complain that the public and the media and politicians often get confused about their organisation. Now that's particularly true for people who take a rights-based animal rights view. They will often complain that groups that they consider as welfarists will be seen in the same kind of philosophical plane as themselves, and so that's a difficulty for people within the movement. At the same time, people in the movement are also fairly confused. When I did my MA, I talked to a guy called Steve in North Wales, and just reconnected with him on Facebook. And he said in one quote that he would know the difference between animal rights and animal welfare in his head, but he wouldn't know how to write it down. You know? So I think there's a lot of people in that kind of situation where they kind of see the connections between the two, and they see the differences between the two, but to actually articulate it in a kind of full sense would be quite difficult for them. In relation to academic analysis of the movement, the academics have been somewhat better in a way at differentiating within the animal movement, and especially the philosophers. But again, there's still quite a bit of confusion in the sense that Hilda Keen's got a book called Animal Rights from 1989. She's a social historian. That's really an animal welfare book, and yet it's called Animal Rights. And there's another book by Susan Sperling called Animal Liberators, which essentially is an anti-vivisection book that she kind of uses those kind of phrases. So we can ask them, and we started this in the intro section really, which, what is it then that divides animal rights from animal welfare? And we do have philosophy to look at that. And I did say that we don't have anything for part one now. Doesn't it like us? Who's on from that? There we go. Okay, can we have that one?
Thank you.
So these are quotes from Singer, Reagan, and Francione, which I suppose are still regarded as the main players in terms of the philosophical approach to what I call human non-human relations. The first thing from Singer, these don't necessarily kind of just outline very carefully their philosophical position. It's more of a kind of general kind of sheet for you, really. But there is some kind of nuances in there. I mean, Singer has distanced himself from the kind of animal, traditional animal welfare, the kind of what he says, the ham-eating hostess that he approached, and she's going, are you interested in animals? And he said, not particularly. I'm more interested in justice, which is often a kind of a thing which might kind of trip some people up. The Reagan thing and the Francione thing are much more of what I would call the rights-based animal rights people. So they start off with human rights and extend it to some version of animal rights. And so that's where you start to get an abolitionist position. You can see that very clearly in the Tom Reagan quote in the middle of the page. It says the case for animal rights. That's not the book. This is the chapter in Peter Singer's book called In Defense of Animals from 1985. So it's not the book from 1983. It says, I regard myself as an advocate for animal rights and part of the animal rights movement. And it talks about the total abolition, the total dissolution, the elimination, etc., etc. And then we get Francione talking about the difference in one of his early commentaries. So that'll be quite useful to start to begin to understand the nuances of the difference between the approaches. If you flick it over to the other side, now I think I mentioned, maybe in an answer to Frank actually in the last session, that Peter Singer used to complain bitterly about being regarded as an animal rights advocate. And it's quite an interesting thing. Within academia, Singer has made a big point of making sure that people realise that he doesn't stand for animal rights. Whereas in the movement, he's been a bit more loose about it. I think accepting the movement as it is, rather, in the sense of, well, people are going to make mistakes, so I'm not necessarily going to pull them up on it. But if you look at the third paragraph there of yours, mine's highlighted, you see down the page, he says quite clearly that this is Peter Singer responding to a review of animal liberation. So this is 1978. Why is it surprising that I have little to say about the nature of rights? It would only be surprising to one who assumes that my case for animal liberation is based upon rights, and in particular upon the idea of extending rights to animals. But that's not my position at all. I have little to say about rights because rights are not important to my argument. Now, there's a lot of people in the press and a lot of people in the media who get confused about this. Surely Peter Singer, who is an animal rights advocate, is not an animal rights advocate. He says that rights as a concept are not important to his argument, and he will probably go along with that utilitarian argument that moral rights are nonsense on stilts. And towards the back end of this article, or at least this page from the article, you'll see that he actually kind of regrets using the concept of rights in his writing and probably thinks that he might not have done it as well. Okay, so that's the general beginning of seeing this differentiation. Another thing in terms of the modern welfare and rights movements is that the latter in particular, the rights movement, would tend to look more at the interconnections between issues, between the suffering and exploitation of both humans and other animals. And of course, feminist theorists will do that as well. There's an irony there because that's similar to the early traditional animal welfarists. For example, the people who were involved with the formation of the RSPCA in England were also the people who formed the NSPCC, the children's charity. Often they were socialists, often they were vegetarians, often they were involved with the socialist movements, particularly the Fabian movement, which was the kind of moderate socialist movement, if you like. You can also see some differences in terms of this split between campaigning slogans, even T-shirt designs, if you like. The Vegan Society, I've still got that on my mug at home. It talks about be vegan for the people, the animals, and the environment, making those connections explicit. A welfare slogan would be more like buy free range and stop live exports. That would be much more of a welfare argument. An animal rights slogan would be animal liberation, human rights, one struggle, one fight. Animal rights would probably have a slogan like Yates is murder. And on Facebook now you get a lot more kind of dairy is murder type things now. A lot of a lot of nuances on that. While the welfarists would probably talk about the concept of freedom foods. So again, it comes really back to this notion of welfare is about treatment while they're being used, and rights is a critique of the use in the first place. So that's the kind of crude difference. From a rights point of view, one of the most famous slogans is the one that was adopted by Peter, initially from the UAV, which is the animals are not ours too. You know, that slogan, which is very, very famous. That was originated, as far as I know, with the UAV, I think. Whereas one of the most famous welfare slogans is, and you'll see this on car stickers, which is a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, right? That one. Okay. There's also a difference in terms of sanctuaries. Notice that Butterflies Cats is looking to look at animal rights sanctuaries as opposed to animal welfare sanctuaries. And so in my MA, I developed this concept which is called animal welfare, animal rights sanctuaries, in the grounds that I knew some people who ran an animal sanctuary in North Wales, and they were strict vegan animal rights campaigners. But they used to have to deal with a lot of welfare issues, and even theoretically, as well as, you know, obviously the care for the animals, obviously. But in terms of people would come to their shop with leather goods, expecting them to be sold, you know, in aid of the animals. Some of the people that volunteered for them would want to eat meat in their shop, and that caused again a problem. They would say, well actually, you know, we've got an issue with that, and they say, well, I care for the animals, but I also eat these ones, you know. So we had that kind of divide. So they had some real kind of problems there, in the sense that they were doing a very difficult job, which is running a sanctuary. And as anybody who's had an experience of running a sanctuary, it's a very, very difficult job. And at the same time, they were having kind of problems with their volunteers on that kind of basis. So let's focus on the concept of animal rights then for this. And we could start with the account of animal rights from Mark Gold. He's got a book called Animal Sanctuary. And he says the first organisation which may be called an animal rights group was the Humanitarian League. The Humanitarian League was founded in 1891 by Henry Salt. Henry Salt is quite an interesting character, although little known sometimes in the movement. He was born in 1851. The formation was 1891, not 51. He was born in 1851. He became a master at Eton, the public school in England, but then he became a vegetarian, and then he became a socialist, which probably didn't quite well fit in, and he became estranged from Eton. His beliefs led him to leave. But again, because he was a socialist and a vegetarian, he started to make these kind of connections. When he formed the Humanitarian League, one of the first things they did was close down the Royal Bookhounds, so took on the royal family straight away, and also launched a campaign against Eton's Beagle Pack. So, as a thank you for his former employee, if you like. In fact, it's Henry Salt who is credited with coining the phrase blood sports, which still rankles very much with hunters If you say the word blood sports to hunters, they'll still go mad about it, and they want to call it hunting or field sports in particular. They dislike the phrase blood sports, which Henry Salt coined. So the League then were the beginning of this idea of linking explicitly ideas together and effectively claiming that campaigning for one was campaigning for all. So the Humanitarian League found themselves having campaigns about child labour, about hunting, about the inhumane treatment of prisoners, about vivisection, the cruel treatment of the mentally ill, corporal punishment, slaughterhouses, and warfare. And I don't know if anyone saw, I posted quite a long quote from Salt on Facebook today, where he's talking about the interlinks. And the one piece of that, which you can see on the events page for this event, the one piece of that which is most well known is when he says, "It is not this bloodshed or that bloodshed that must cease, but all needless bloodshed, all wanton infliction of pain or death upon our fellow beings." So a kind of wide spectrum which he kind of used. His own influence was widespread on others. For example, he influenced Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria got involved with what became the RSPCA. He influenced Gandhi, Shelley, G.B. Shaw, Pankhurst, Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister in England, G.K. Chesterton, Kerr Hardy, the first Labour MP in England, and also chaired the Humane League conferences, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb. So they were part and parcel of campaigns, as I said, and they achieved things like the banning of flogging within the Royal Navy, which is about something like 1906, and they also were prime movers in the establishment of the Court of Appeal, and they supported the Prison Act of 1898. Also, he was very big into conservation, the provision of the national parks. In 1908, Henry Salt called for Snowdonia, the Peak District, the Lake District and the Scottish Highlands in the UK to be preserved in their wilderness as a treasured property of the people. And he even protested against the picking of wildflowers. And rather ahead of his time, perhaps, he warned about the dangers of polluting streams and rivers with chemicals. So, this is why Mark Gold essentially picked Salt out as the first animal rights person who made all those connections in that sense. In terms of social movement theorising, the movement which the Humanitarian League represented never really took off. In some senses, its influence was gained by influencing the influential, and in some senses that's not enough. You need a broader base of support for that. There was also no sense of mobilising resources, which social movement theorists would say is an issue. They didn't set up offices, they didn't sort out staff, that kind of thing. And essentially, the Gold report says, the outbreak of the First World War ended things for the Humanitarian League. Total pacifism at the time of the First World War wasn't a great thing. So the League ended in 1919, and by this time, Henry Salt was 70, and he wrote his autobiography, which has got a brilliant title. Does anybody know Henry Salt's autobiography title? It's 70 Years Among Savages. which is probably an interesting title, but maybe not as consolatory as it could be. That was 1921. And he said this, and this is the important part, because it brings us right up to the 1970s. He says, I have failed, and he says, the League members were 1 to 200 years ahead of the rest of society. That's what he thought was the case. And I say that was overly pessimistic, because we could jump 50 years ahead to the 1970s, not have to go to 100 or 200 years, to see the next big step in the story of animal rights with bunny rabbit ears. Because now we get to the stage where at Oxford University, a philosopher or philosophical student called Peter Singer met an ethical vegetarian, and he did the usual thing about, why are you eating that rather than normal stuff to this guy, and this chap explained that he and his partner were vegetarians. Now Peter Singer saw that as a challenge and set about proving the guy wrong. That's what started Singer off in the first place. He said, well, that can't be right. There's nothing wrong with eating animals, etc., etc. I'll prove you wrong. He then delved into the issue. He couldn't refute it and ended up adopting the views of vegetarians because he couldn't refute them, which is a similar story to Ronnie Lee, if anybody knows that story, where I think he met his girlfriend's his sister's boyfriend, who was vegetarian, and he said that the guy looked strong and fit. In fact, he was an athlete for the county or something, and that kind of didn't fit Ronnie's stereotype of vegetarians, that kind of thing. And so he kind of tried to kind of challenge that and couldn't, and then adopted the vegan diet as well. Okay, so by 1974 then, Animal Liberation had been written. Within 50 years of SALT then, the book that most commentators accept prompted the development of what you could call second wave animal advocacy was written. In terms of social movement theory, Peter Singer can be regarded as a very influential movement entrepreneur. You could regard his book as a mobilizing resource, and it served to kickstart a new movement. If people talk about the influence of animal liberation on their lives, that's exactly what they would say, that it was the first time that all these issues came together, a description of factory farming and other types of animal use, along with a kind of theoretical reason for not doing it, kind of gelled with them. So it kickstarted a new movement, or you could say it reinvigorated an old one, which other people have said that there was a kind of reinvigoration going on in the 1970s. Singer himself said that the modern animal movement may have happened anyway, and that can be seen in social movement terms, theory terms, as evoking the idea of latent networks or submerged networks, these ideas. That there are kind of grievances, social grievances, that kind of just are there in society, and every now and again they congeal into a movement, and then sometimes they go away again, but they're still, the issues are still there. So that's why people also talk about movement cycles, and also about peaks and troughs and that kind of thing. So it's interesting because from the press and the public point of view, the issue of animal rights or the issue of animal protection, animal welfare, whatever you want to say, it might just kind of peak every now and again and it becomes part of their consciousness. They see it in the press, they hear it on the radio, and then it's a concern to them, like exports, whatever. And then it disappears. Of course, for the people in the movement, it's never disappeared. We're all still there. It's just that it's not in the public consciousness, So that's one thing that's interesting to note, that for the public point of view, the animal rights movement might actually just kind of go in and out, of their consciousness again. So it remains the case then that animal liberation caused a stir that created a movement. There were other people developing pro-animal ideas in the 1970s. Andrew Lindsay, a kind of Christian-based but also a rights-based view, and Richard Ryder, who started off really as a psychologist, and he wrote an anti-vivisection book, Victims of Science, and then moved into philosophy. And I suppose Ryder is now famous for this idea called painism, but he also coined the phrase speciesism. Peter Singer is often credited with coining the phrase. He didn't. He popularised it. Richard Ryder coined it. I'll say, so commentators tend to agree that this time, the 1970s, represents the beginning of the animal rights movement proper, if you like, or, as I said before, could be regarded as a second wave if account is given to SALT in the same way as we talk about first wave and second wave feminism. Being described as the animal rights revival of the 1970s, and as I said there, this allows that theorising about campaign cycles and burnout, about reinvigoration, all those things can be in there. Also the idea of mobilising resources, which we should get to resource mobilisation, not in the session to follow this, but the one after that, I think. Animal liberation certainly gave the animal movement a new and powerful means of recruiting new members, so that was another aspect of recruitment, because it was the most powerful piece of writing on what I call human non-human relations for years, and it received a lot of media attention. And the media attention in those days was quite good, so I've just done 6 of these to pass around. There's not enough for everybody, but this is the document that if you just kind of pass them along a little bit. Essentially, what you've got there is a front page after a raid that took place. It was called Operation Valentine because it was done on Valentine's Day. But you'll see the headline is, what is it, freedom or, that kind of thing. These are the kind of headlines that people would dream about nowadays, because usually anything as militant as that would just be terrorist this now and bombs that and everything else. This is very kind of a positive media attention. And it's attention like that the animal movement was subject to very positive attention throughout the 70s or late 70s and into up to kind of mid 80s. Very positive. You would do stuff and you would find that it's only recently that all that terrorist thing started, which completely kind of changes the way. So Singer had articulated a concern which has been expressed by what you could regard as latent individuals who only had traditional animal welfare organisations to join. It also coincided with the growing militancy within the Hunt Saboteurs movement, and then the formation of Band of Mercy, and then the Animal Liberation Front. The ICI Smoking Beagles affair in the 1970s, very early 1970s, caused a very big media storm. And all in all then, in terms of social movement theory, you could see that everything was kind of coming together. I often say that in the early 1980s, someone said to me, "We'll have won this within 10 years." And at the time, I didn't think that was a ridiculous thing to say. We actually thought it. Everything seemed to have just gelled. And it was kind of like full steam ahead then, as it were. Even some of the traditional groups like the League Against Cruel Sports were reinvigorated by this new energy. They often tactically were seen as the respectable part of the anti-blood sports movement, and they distanced themselves from the HSA. Sea Shepherd UK launched campaigns in the Orkneys and Ireland. They went to Mayo in the late 70s, early 80s. In the Orkneys, they teamed up with the Hunt Saboteurs and with Greenpeace International. And there's that story about Greenpeace pulling out after the Scottish office reduced the kill from 6,000 to 2,000. Then also, in the 1980s, we have the formation of the Liberation Leagues. The first one was the Northern Animal Liberation League, formed in 1980. They specialised in large-scale raids. They tended to do very little or no damage, and they're looking essentially for information and photographs, documentation, those kind of things. The resources that the NAL was able to mobilise was the commitment of the young activists. And at this time, activists were entering a movement and they wanted to do things, not to necessarily find themselves running jumble cells, that kind of stuff. The things that were exposed by the book Animal Liberation was a real kind of resource for them as well. It gave them a green light to attack the forms of oppression as they saw it. The NAL was followed by the SEAL and the CAL, the Southeast Animal Liberation League and the Central Animal Liberation League. And then also in 1982, a big event for my generation was the launch of my generation's Earthlings, which was called the Animals film by Victor Schoenfeld. This had a large impact on recruitment. It came out in 1982. It featured in the first week of a new TV network in England called Channel 4, and it was 2.5 hours long, and they just showed it all the way through. The shock value of that was fairly immense, although it's ironic really, it's fairly tame compared with the Earthlings. In fact, Schoenfeld, if you buy the DVD version of Gamble's film, Schoenfeld, the director, explains why they cut in pieces of, vox pop and cartoons even, and this kind of stuff, and just to kind of bring people down a little bit, so it wasn't full on like Earthlings, you just unremitting kind of horror kind of thing. It's not like that with the Animals film. By the mid-80s, the ALF policy changed, and there became a stress on committing damage or economic sabotage as they saw it, rather than liberating animals directly, largely to do with the fact that their homes were drying up. So by this time, the national organisations were becoming unsettled by all this, especially because this also coincided with a push to put animals into politics. So we had things like the Mobilisation for Laboratory Animals, which is a coalition of the BUAV, Animal Aid, the Scottish Anti-Vivisection Society, and the National Anti-Vivisection Society. And then we had the Animal Protection Alliance in 1983 as well, coalition of the League Against Cruel Sports, the BUAV, and Compassion of All Farming. So they grew very quickly then. In other words, a movement grew, forging ahead, and then there started to be tensions within it. That's essentially what we're saying. The ALF were expelled from the BUAV offices, and so they set up in Hammersmith in London, and the militancy under their name increased, and ALF groups even developed incendiary devices. Incendiary devices are obviously, it's quite a name to attach to something, but in actual fact they were devices based on 2 firelighters. And they are mentioned in the press always as bombs. There's no explosives involved. In fact, the weird thing about these fire bombs, as they're also called in the press, is that they were designed to create smoke. And so the damage that they caused was water damage, because it relied on the sprinklers of the store to do the damage. Yeah. There was one shop in Plymouth, I think, called Dingles, that burnt down because the sprinkler system didn't work. Yeah. And I always say, ironically, the ALF might have been responsible for saving human lives there, because it didn't fail in the middle of the night, whereas it didn't fail, if it failed in the middle of the day, it might be different. Animal Aid were now increasingly hostile to militancy under the leadership of Mark Gold. And so by the time we're talking about 1980s in England in particular, there's a substantial dip in animal rights activity. And this, in theoretical terms, is seen as things like result of cycles, the result of burnout, a loss of energy within the movement, the impetus has gone. And then, on a more practical level, imprisonment was an issue. So the cost of involvement in the animal movement seriously increased. And there's a caveat to that as well, in the sense that when people were first arrested and given a few months, it became the standard. And then I remember somebody got something like 16 months, and we all thought that was outrageous, And of course, I don't suppose people realised that within 10 years, people would be getting 16 years rather than 16 months. So the cost of involvement with that type of militancy really kind of increased. In the early 1990s, the Live Export campaign made it big in England and became front page and TV news for months and months. This is where we saw an interesting juxtaposition between people who regard themselves as animal rights people and people who regard themselves as animal welfare. Local regional groups were involved. Compassion All Farming claimed some role in it. They were wary of attaching their name to it a little bit. Carla Lane, the scriptwriter, the playwright, she had a big group involved with the English live export campaigns.
Sorry, just have a question. To what extent I'm just reading Morrissey's autobiography. Did he have a galvanizing role at all?
Morrissey,
Or was he just.
I say the punk movement would be more, yeah. I mean, really, apart from Meet His Murder, the song, and the album did go to #1. And I think I have seen people claim on Facebook, for example, that it was that album and his thing that made them kind of go vegetarian or / vegan or something. But I would have thought the punk movement would have probably been more influential. But then there's a generational gap between those. So, I don't know, anybody influenced by Morrissey in this room? I don't know, actually. I'm not quite sure about what his legacy would be. I do know that some people in the vegan community who are Smiths fans would look more towards Marr than Morrissey, because Johnny Marr, isn't it? Johnny Marr is vegan, whereas there's ambiguity about the position of Morrissey.
It's only recently vegan.
Well, some people say he's not vegan at all, so yeah, I don't know. I know that there's a kind of.
Certainly in his book, he's very insistent on his animal. He described himself as an animal protectionist.
Yes.
And he, if somebody's eating a meal with containing an animal, he walks out. Even if it's a close collaborator, business company, you just walk out.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That I used to know a playwright, still know a playwright, but he would do that. And when he became powerful to be a BBC producer, / director, he would make everybody on the set be vegan. Gordon Newman. Yeah. And the stories about them kind of trotting off down to McDonald's at the end of the day, because they've got 8 hours without meat and they're just about to explode. So yeah, he used to have that same attitude, because he effectively said, and I don't know if Morris makes his point, that if he was sat at a table and somebody was abusing a child, you wouldn't just let it be.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he also insisted that in all constant things that there wouldn't be any need to.
Yeah, I wonder how much control that they've got on that. Is that part of their contracts then? Is it?
Well, it was when the Smiths were touring in the 80s. And this, going into America, going into sort of very, off the beaten track kind of places.
He does that now himself, in solo.
Right, yeah, true this.
Well, he must have some gigs where he can do it every day, I don't think so.
Yeah, the festival's about halfway through it because he gets that hot dogs one. I don't know where it was.
Yeah, there are stories walking off.
It's also a good way of getting headlines, I suppose. But
Sales, right.
But I don't think it's done many favours commercially. Maybe it has.
No, well, I suppose he doesn't really need that in that sense. I suppose he feels rich and powerful enough not to have to kind of bow to that particularly. And obviously, in the movement, the more interesting case in a way is McCartney, because he's seen as more embedded in the movement, particularly Peter. But Peter also used Morrissey, don't they? So Morrissey identifies animal rights with Peter, which would be a controversial thing to do, but so does Paul McCartney. And McCartney's interesting because I think Stella McCartney is vegan, and he's made the claim that he knows he should be vegan, but he can't do it. Sometimes it's because that when you're touring, it's difficult. Although I do know that when Wings were touring, I think they used to take kind of effectively a restaurant and chef with them. So that wouldn't really be the case. Either. But I would have thought that people like Morrissey, and particularly McCartney, they've got enough money to make sure that they can feed vegan wherever they are.
I was looking through sort of accounts in the Irish newspapers, just keyword searching vegan, going back to the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And it seemed like you very rarely get a mention of the term vegan except in connection with a musician like Morrissey or Moby. Moby more latterly.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
And then the odds.
And that would just be a line, really, essentially.
No, well, like they would just, a music journalist would interview him, and there would be reference to it, and Moby might talk a little bit about because he was really big in the 90s.
Yeah, that's right.
And he would talk about his beliefs. So that was the way of getting exposure and getting into the media, rather than through animal rights advocacy.
Yeah.
Or through health or environment. Or whatever.
So you've got a whole database now on
No, there's very few mentions in the Irish Times.
Right. Okay.
Pitifully few.
And did you look elsewhere besides the...
No, I don't think they have digital. I don't think I can search digitally
okay.
with other newspapers.
Alright. But they'll have an archive, won't they? Christian?
They would have an archive, but I'd have to go through each article. Each paper. Whereas the Irish Times,
Do they have microchief thing?
they do, but the Irish Times, I can go very quickly, keyword search,
Okay.
and it'll throw up all the.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I've just got a couple more things to say because I was trying to bring this kind of case study up to date, and Bernie's here. We might be able to throw in a few Irish examples in a minute with a bit of luck, because when this course was originated, it was in North Wales, and so most of the examples, just about all the examples, are from the UK, really. Not least the example of the National Anti-Vivisection Society. They branched out and exposed Chippendale's circus, and they became animals defenders. It was interesting. What happened with the anti-vivisection groups in England was that they realised that their constitution and remit limited what they could do. They had to campaign against vivisection. Yeah, so they wanted to branch out from that. The BOAV, for example, they helped launch the Fur Action Group and a couple of other things which can broaden their kind of range. Also, when they were radicalised in the early 80s, they brought the ALF in, as it were, but also started to look at other issues. But it's interesting because there's an archive now of some of those early BOAV newspapers, which is called The Liberator. When it was radicalised in 1981-82, we went into the BOAV offices, the existing ones, Charing Cross Road, and we opened up their stock cupboard, and there was a few books by the director, who's been ousted, and but then there was lots of tea towels with Harrogate written on it for some reason, and then some of their magazines which got animal welfare, so they changed that to Liberator. But even if you go to the archive, which is your point really at the time, there's hardly any mention of veganism, apart from the odd vegan society thing. Which is why when people claim that veganism is the moral baseline, it never became fully. It's still becoming fully the moral baseline. It was never totally accepted. And anyway, that idea is new. And Ronnie Lee's talked about this on his own podcast, where everybody he knew, or most people he knew in the 1980s, the same would apply to me, were vegans, but we didn't campaign for veganism. We were campaigning against hunting or anti-vivisection, those kind of things. And we would carefully separate these things out and never make any overarching vegan claim. So that's the thing that has changed. Now people like Francione are still not kind of happy about that, whereas I tend to think that because animal advocates like single issues, they can see the point of them, and they want to do them essentially, then the best thing to do is try to abolitionize them, which for me means presenting them in an overarching vegan context. And that is new. We've not done that for years. So, sometimes some of the militant people have often said, we've been doing this vegan education for years and years and years, not getting anywhere. It's not true. Vegan education as a campaigning thing is actually a new thing within the movement. So we shouldn't be too quick to say
we can't make it more than animal rights.
Sorry?
Encompassing more than animal rights, human rights.
It should. That's right. That goes back to the link thing. At the moment, there's controversy in the movement about whether we should be focusing just on the other animals or whether we should be concentrating on the interlinks. Like the feminists would say, people like Richard Deboo in Belfast, he's having a big fight with a group called Non-Humans First, I think the group is called, and they're effectively saying, leave your human politics at the door. We whoever you are, if you care about animals, you're in, type of thing. That's very difficult within a movement that sees itself as a justice movement. So it's difficult to welcome racists and sexists, and now fascists in the movement. So there's a lot of problems growing at the moment with this idea that we don't care about human politics, we just care about animal rights. And other people say, wait a minute, it's always been based on an acknowledgement of human rights. I mean, animal rights theory, going back to Reagan and Francione, animal rights theory is based on ideas drawn from human rights thought. So we can't divorce it. Okay, in the eyes of many in the 1990s, the BUAV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, had gone soft, not least because it dropped their opposition to all animal experiments. It used to say on their thing, BUAV against all animal experiments, and then they changed it to BUAV against animal experiments. They dropped it all out of their campaigning slogan. And this created, in theoretical terms, a campaigning space which was filled with the likes of Uncaged, who gave a talk in Dublin a few years ago. There became then a focus on coalitions of local and regional activists, and this is where we start to see a big focus on grassroots campaigning in England. It's quite interesting. People like Neil Lee in ARC News, they were starting to put out their own magazines and essentially bypassing the national groups. The national groups used to have something of a kind of two-way relationship with some of the grassroots campaigners, although all the money tends to end up with the national groups, which was a problem. But eventually, the grassroots people started to really just boycott them, in that sense. The interesting thing from a social movement theory about the grassroots movement is it doesn't do what automatically seems to be done in the national or multinational groups, which is this idea of moving towards professionalisation. Once you start to get people saying we need to professionalise, that often gets translated into meaning things like we want staff, we want officers, For these people in the 1990s, the focus was on action, not structure in terms of infrastructure, those kind of things. And then, again, very strongly with social movement theorising, which will come up later in this kind of mini-course, is that some of these people were liable to see themselves as part of a tribe. And that's some of the latest social movement theorising has seen people as part of a tribe. And so you'd find them on animal rights demos, but then you'd find them on road protest demos, you'd find them on anti-globalisation activities, and they would, just join forces. And essentially then, you wouldn't really have any groups that featured as an entity at all. They would almost like be formed spontaneously on the day, do their thing, and then dissipate again, And there was a big movement like that in North Wales when I was there, which was based on kind of Earth First, kind of road protests, doing the kind of lock-ons to stop development and this kind of stuff, stop new motorways, all those kind of villages that they built in forests and that kind of stuff, stop them being shot down. But essentially, they didn't really belong to any group. They just formed a group, sometimes with a funny, amusing name, and then it just dissipated again. So it was a different way of looking at how to do campaigning. And I think probably there still might be a tension between national groups and grassroots mobilisations even now. Then we have, this is where we get to issues where Bernie can fill us in on probably, a deliberate targeting of individual businesses. And under various campaigning names, they managed to close down Consort Beagles, which is a beagle breeding thing. Hillgrove Cat Farm was closed down. Regal Rabbits was closed down. Newchurch Guinea Pig Farm. And now, most of those people then focus their attention on Huntingdon Life Sciences, which is a campaign that continues. And there is kind of like, if you like, Irish branches of that, isn't there? Okay. So did the Irish activists, for Consort and Hillgrove, did people go over for those?
Well, yeah, people used to go over, yeah.
Okay.
Hillgrove, where was that? New Church, I think.
Okay. And so,
But not many, I can say that.
no.
Not many.
your timeless complaint.
What? Yeah.
And so, does this story from England, as it were, mirror the experience of Ireland, do you think?
Well, we're on a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
But a lot of the campaigns followed what England was doing, I have to say, especially with the shack stuff and that. It's gone on a few years now.
Yeah.
But we had the shack over here, and sort of if they wanted something done, we do the bit over here, you know. So.
And the national groups that exist in Ireland, do you think they saw themselves really as a kind of branch of an English group? I mean, obviously, Compassion Wolf Farming would be the obvious one there. There would be Compassion Wolf Farming Ireland, so that would be a kind of bona fide branch. Yeah, but then I wonder whether. I mean, obviously, the anti-blood sports movement would take its lead from the HSA.
That came a bit later here. Well, thinking back in 1966, I joined ICAPS.
That is going back a bit.
It is going, yeah, I was 13 at the time, and that was all there was to join. There was nothing before that. The ICAPS, Irish Council Against Blood Sports. But they were a welfare group against hunting, I'd say, and coursing, but didn't want to take a stand against fishing or shooting because that was too radical.
So that they're like the League Against Blood Sports in English terms.
Yeah, the league used to work with them. The league wouldn't work with us as SABs. No. But anyway, they were the first group, and then a fire in 1989. I was there from 1989, that's when they started that year. I didn't start it, but I was there about a month in on it. I passed the stand and picked up a leaflet.
Yeah, and so the story in Ireland is similar to the story in England, but it's smaller scale and much later. That's.
Yeah, well, CIWF were funded from England, the office that was down in Cork.
Yeah.
That's gone now.
But all the groups that we're familiar with now, Liberation.
Well, they weren't around.
No, I mean this is kind of what, late 90s.
Yeah, there was really only a fire, and a few months later, I started the Hunt Sabs.
Yeah.
I started Irish Hunt Sabs, and there was one person that we had to get rid of, so we reformed overnight into Association of Hunt Saboteurs, which is still going.
So it was first called Irish Hunt Sabs.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was 3 of us started that.
Right.
So the Hunt Sabs continue, a fire continues. Along the way, there was A Liberation with Ed and Gloria. NARA started in 2007, I think.
Yeah, it began out in 2009.
Was it? Yeah. Okay.
So I mean, we're talking about a much younger movement in Ireland.
Well, CIWF has gone now. Carrie, of course, is still down there.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's it, really.
Okay.
Are we forgetting anybody? Oh yeah, campaign for the abolition of cruel sports, John Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
But he's around since.
But that's mainly hair crossing, is that right?
Hair coursing, yeah.
Okay.
Primarily.
Okay, so in terms of a case study, then we're kind of up to date, and so what we'll find then, if you are still interested enough to attend the theory side of things, you'll start to see the connections with how the theories kind of marry in with what we understand as the case study of the movement, and we'll begin that after a cup of tea.